Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm going to be your host of Cut the Crop today. And so welcome Andy Pitman, who is the FAR General Manager of Research and Development. So FAR has talked a lot in the past about SGRR, which is Seed and Grain Readiness and Response, which is the vehicle by which we've signed up to work with the government on readiness and response activities for biosecurity. But of course that is very operational. It's linked into sort of formal engagement with the government. FAR of course has its own R&D that we do, and a lot of that is related to biosecurity. And we also interact with a lot of other research agencies who do biosecurity related work. So I guess it would be good to be able to share with the growers what we do in that space as well. Yep. So you're in charge of all of our R&D activities in the biosecurity space. So what does FAR do?
Yep, so I guess in the biosecurity space, FAR's quite lucky. It's lucky because biosecurity is such a high priority for all of the industries, the agricultural industries. So it always comes up as number one for agricultural industries across the board. I think a survey in 2013 showed that it was number one for over 100 different industries and sectors, and that's really retained its position. And so industries are very active and government have prioritised biosecurity, and so there's quite a nice framework for being able to leverage up investment to be able to do R&D for biosecurity and biosecurity in the arable sector. And so that's what we try to do. We try to leverage up, and especially in this space, and we've got a lot of connections into R&D programs.
What the big ticket items are that FAR's either involved in itself or that we're leveraging into other programs?
Yeah, I think it's sort of governance, but also operational. I know that there's the Plant Biosecurity Council, which you sit on and represent the arable industry, and I guess they have the opportunity to have oversight on R&D activities, especially when there's a key risk organism. And so some R&D, R&D programs are initiated through that process. But our main vehicle really for engaging in R&D and biosecurity is what's called the B3, or Better Border Biosecurity Program.
And I know a lot about B3, but our growers may not. So you better give us an explanation of what B3 is and how FAR interacts with it.
Yep, so B3 is really a collaborative program that was started maybe some 20 years ago, and it's a collaboration between generally the CRIs, that's the Crown Research Institutes, that are there to support industry. And so that's the likes of AgResearch or Plant and Food Research and Landcare, who are now Menaki Whenua, and I think Scion are in there as well. And they also link into the universities, and industry is a big player too, so they sit on the governance and they of that program, and they also, I guess there is an opportunity on a regular basis to have stakeholder meetings, so the industry members and MPI and some of the other users of biosecurity information and R&D get to sit around a table and hear what's happening around research and be part of the process. So that's the B3 program as such. It's a very sophisticated program at this stage. It's over $10 million, housing a large amount of biosecurity investment, which probably is world leading.
Yeah, and of course it is in the main focused on the border.
Absolutely.
And it's on understanding, sort of pathways of pests coming into New Zealand and developing tools and technologies to try and detect and manage things at the border. So what are the arable related projects?
Yeah, so the R&D is split into five themes. And those 5 themes, as you say, one is the first ones are around risk assessment. So at the very start, the question is, what do you prioritise to look at? Because you could look at a million different things. And so there are 2 themes around that. One is on intentional incursions. So that is where we might want to bring in a biocontrol agent. And we did that and have done that for a long, long time. And it's only recently we suddenly realized that actually those agents can actually have consequences. And so there is a program around that. There is also a program around risk assessment of unintentional incursions or risk organisms, and that is where we're just horizon scanning and trying to understand what organisms are likely to land on our doorstep, a bit like BMSB. If you're not aware, BMSB is brown marmorated stink bug. So brown marmorated stink bug, just for those of you who know, likes to hitchhike on lots of different products coming in on shipments, especially on cars and tractors and those kind of things.
And the reason we're interested is because it can attack maize.
Absolutely. So it attacks, I think, several hundred different species of plants. In the horticultural and in the arable space, as well as other areas. So maize is a particularly interesting host for it, and so we're interested in it from that perspective. And I know that you're on, I guess, the operational agreement with some of the other industries to discuss how we might preempt R&D and activities in that space. So that's one of the areas, and that's in that risk, I guess, associated with that risk assessment pathway. You then have something like mitigation of those risk pathways. So that is trying to develop tools and technologies that mitigate those key pathways for the, incursions to take place. So you can imagine that people getting off planes, which is not such an issue at the moment from overseas, they carry a high risk to them, but also all of the shipping routes. And so, for example, Taronga port is a very, very central place for high risk organisms to enter New Zealand. And so, for example, B3 has a project in there to really, it's called actually Excellence in Ports, in biosecurity, and they're actually looking to try to build a community around the port that can support better biosecurity. You also then have diagnostics team. That's probably self-explanatory. That's trying to get better ways to detect threats to New Zealand, and that can be insect pests or it can be pathogens, and also weed ingress, or weed incursions. So a good example of what's going on there is looking at biosensors. So there are biosensors being developed that can detect volatiles, chemicals being given off by insects that are we wouldn't be able to pick up, but biosensors can. And you can imagine that those can be used within containers to try and pick up organisms such as BMSB, I guess, if they give off certain volatiles that we can detect. So there's work in that kind of space too. And then the final theme, which is really around eradication technologies, I guess. And that's when something gets in, how can we actually respond? So that responsiveness and that eradication. And there's a few different projects going on in that space around how you might eradicate an organism. So a good example of a project in that space, which actually has direct links to the arable industry, is using remote sensing. So trying to use remote sensing, drones in particular. And if we know, for example, that a threat to maize, such as BMSB, has gotten into the country, what they're trying to do is trying to understand whether they can actually locate all the crops that are being grown at that one time. So using remote sensing, can we detect by virtue of colour generally and patterns all the maize crops in an area to be able to delineate or show where we need to survey and keep an eye for spread of that BMSB. That can go one step further, so that's the basic part. But what you can actually do, and they're doing this in Australia, interestingly, for fall armyworm experimentally, is you can use remote sensing to actually look at the crop, but look at damage created by an invasive organism. So fall armyworm as an example, and I can come to that later, but that has a certain pattern of damage that it creates on maize, and you can go looking for those patterns in maize, and they've shown quite successfully that they can pick up damage within crops using remote sensing. So some really exciting technologies and tools that we might be able to bring to bear to help biosecurity in general, but also the arable industry.
Yeah. So, I mean, sort of, and we all know early detection, it substantially increases your chance of successful eradication.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt that early detection is critical if you can. Normally what they say, and I worked in the space of diagnostics, is that if you can detect it, it's probably a bit too late. But actually the tools are getting more and more sensitive. And so actually we've got an opportunity to be able to pick those up relatively early. And I mean, if you look at some of the work that's been done around BMSB, we're constantly hearing of interceptions at the border, but to date we haven't found any established populations, and so that suggests that actually our means of trying to detect and keep that organism out is actually working relatively well. And that really is an ongoing and persistent threat.
And so we know, I mean, BMSB has been on our radar for quite a while. What other sort of key pests or pathogens are on our radar that if it got into New Zealand, it would have the potential to sort of cause a major problem?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is that we engage with all of B3, and a lot of that is transformational work or really forward-thinking work, but we also do what we call horizon scanning to understand what our risks are, those emerging risks. And you mentioned BMSB has been around for quite some time, we know about it, but we actually do contract out external parties to help us horizon scan and just see what's coming out. And actually MPI do quite a good job of providing stakeholders like ourselves, industry members, with information on what they're hearing from globally around increasing threats. And one of those threats that's been increasing over the last 5 years is something called fall armyworm. And fall armyworm is essentially a lepidopteran, so it ends up being a moth in its adult life, and but is actually damaging to crops when it's in its caterpillar form. And it can actually devastate maize crops, for example. And there are plenty of incidences where a farmer has gone to bed on a Friday night, gone to look at and the crop's been looking excellent. This is overseas, and then come back on Sunday morning, look at the crop, and it's essentially disappeared. So it's got a huge potential impact, and also its life cycle means that it is of imminent threat to New Zealand, or of arriving in New Zealand. So that is an emerging threat that has pretty much gone from its native range in the Americas, in the Southern American areas, right across Africa, causing quite a lot of damage in Africa. It's also in North America, and this year has been a particularly bad year in North America. And then it's also gone into China and into that Asian area, down into Southeast Asia, crossed the strait into Australia, and is now establishing itself in Australia. So it's pretty close on our doorstep.
And so, I mean, our dilemma is that we have so many different crops that we have oversight over, and all of those crops have potentially many, many, many pests and diseases. So there's no way that we can do detailed assessments on every individual thing. So it really has to be this constant scanning of what are the priority things that are likely to come in, and how important are they for us if they did, so that we can allocate our resources sort of as effectively as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're like I said, we're quite lucky that the New Zealand's network for biosecurity, both in operational from an operational perspective and from an R&D perspective, is pretty sophisticated from global in terms of the global context, and there are large industries that dedicate people to biosecurity on their own, as you know, and so we are tied into those people through our networks, through your council, and through B3 and through other avenues, and that allows us really to be not too bad at hearing about those risks that are emerging, and it's absolutely critical for us to be able to establish resource. I mean, one of the projects in B3 that we're actually trying to get up and running, which will be of interest to arable growers, builds on a program that was funded by Dairy NZ. And worked with AgResearch and Craig Phillips from AgResearch, and they were establishing a framework for being able to establish what risks existed for their industry. And so they were actually they have a much more sophisticated framework for animals because that's a focus for them, but they move their attention to plants. And so they've worked in this space to provide this framework. And this framework sort of has key criteria to establish what the risk of an organism is. So what they do is they collect information from all the literature and databases, they scour the globe, and they're actually trying to automate that process to capture all the names of all the organisms, for example, insects that can be on ryegrass. They capture all of that information, and then they use a criteria to establish the high-risk organisms. Then they go through this assessment of whether it's likely to establish, because that is actually a key criteria. And a good example is where fall armyworm we know is a mostly tropical organism, and so we know that it won't establish permanent populations, or is unlikely to, in the southern parts of New Zealand. But we know then that it might be targeted to northern regions, and so they look at this establishment and spread likelihood as well, and then you get this package to understand what are the priority risks. And we are trying to work with AgResearch, and we're just initiating some conversations with Dairy NZ, because they've done a lot of work on pasture species, which of course overlap quite strongly with our interests. And so we want to be able to come to the party and support them. And also it makes sense for us to be able to share information on the key species that they're interested in: plantain, maize, forage cereals, ryegrass. They've done a lot of work in this space. So we get the opportunity through these networks to establish the risks of organisms pretty well.
And I mean, we do our own sort of on-farm biosecurity sort of extension and guidance work as well, because you can do as much R&D as you've got money to do, and we can try and keep things out, but the reality is that some things will get through, and if it gets through the port, then it will be the grower, the farmer, that actually is likely to be the first person that will detect something. And so we do need to have our farmers and our growers very aware of biosecurity on their farm.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Biosecurity, as you know, is one of those things that you it's an out there, it's a future potential issue, and so we know that all our growers are dealing with on the ground existing issues, that are coming towards them and just trying to manage their crops. So getting to a place where you can actually think about future threats is actually quite difficult, because you're dealing with those day to day. And so we do have a role to play in trying to just heighten awareness of biosecurity risks and how you might be able to manage that on farm. We've had previous funding, SFF funding, to sort of look at on-farm biosecurity, and we've created modules as part of sort of farm planning modules, as part of the sort of farm environment plans and the integrated farm planning process, where you can start to consider how you might be able to mitigate biosecurity risk on your farms.
What are our plans over the next couple of years? Have we got any particular focus that we want to invest in R&D in the biosecurity space? Yeah,
so actually the B3 program is on plants at the border, and it's always focused on insects and pathogens until the last couple of years. It's now moved into the weed space a little bit more, and it's actually starting to create these synergies between weed researchers and build up capability. And as we know, weeds are a really important issue for us, management issue for us in the arable sector.
I mean, it's one of the challenges that FAR has and will continue to have is, how much of our time and effort and money do we spend on biosecurity versus, spending time on the here and now and the things that are affecting the growers at the moment. And it's trying to get that balance, because if we did get a major pest, to come in and attack cereals, it could completely undermine the industry overnight. But if we don't get anything coming in, then people will say, why have you spent all of this money on biosecurity related things?
Yeah, I guess so. That's always the challenge, is the balance of investment. I think we can make the case for biosecurity investment. Again, how you apportion that is a different story. But actually, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, we're really lucky that there's an amazing framework by which we can leverage up our levies to get a lot greater work. So in actual fact, we don't have to invest huge amounts of money in the biosecurity space to really be part of a network that can mitigate against biosecurity issues for the arable industry.
Yeah, which is a really good, positive sort of message to end on.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Andy.
No worries.
And thank you very much, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.